In the autumn of 1883, when the county of Harlan in eastern Kentucky had not yet finished burying its war dead, the town of Caldwell Crossing held an auction for a piece of property no one wanted. It stood at the western edge of a ridge road set back from the ruts by a low stone wall that had been losing its mortar for 20 years. The structure was a chapel, rectangular, perhaps 40 feet by 20, built from local limestone sometime before the conflict that had left so many of the valley's families halved. The county had condemned it in the spring. The roof joists had failed. The east gable was cracked through from lintel to foundation. A notice had been affixed to the oak door. Then the door had swung loose on one hinge and the notice had blown into the creek. The auctioneer was a man named Holt, and he was not unkind, but he had no patience for sentiment on a cold morning. He described the lot in plain terms: 1/5 of an acre, an unroofed stone shell, a half-mile from the nearest working well. He said the chapel had belonged to the Caldwell Ridge Methodist congregation until the congregation ceased to exist. He did not say why the congregation had ceased. He set the opening bid at $5 and waited. No one moved. He lowered it to $2, then to $1. A young woman at the rear of the small crowd raised her hand. She wore a cream floral dress faded to the color of old paper and a vivid red wool shawl drawn tight against the October cold. The men around her turned to look. One of them laughed, low and without particular malice, the way a man laughs at something that requires no comment. Holt asked her name. She said it plainly: Nora Kane. He wrote it in his ledger with the sum $1, and she counted out 4 quarters from a small leather coin purse. And the chapel was hers. What no one in that crowd knew, and what she had not yet said aloud, was that she had come to Caldwell Crossing specifically for this purchase. Not from any nearby county seat. From Lexington, where her father had taught her stonework from the time she was old enough to hold a small cold chisel. Fletcher Kane had been a mason of the old school, trained in the English manner, working limestone and sandstone and the occasional marble footing. He had come to Kentucky from Pennsylvania in his 30s with a set of handled chisels in a canvas roll and a reputation among builders that preceded him on the road. Contractors who hired him said he worked slowly, which was true, and that the walls he built did not move, which was also true. He had no sons. His wife had died of fever when Nora was 6 years old. He had not remarried. He had taken Nora to his jobs from the time she was 7, and by the time she was 12, she was mixing mortar and reading the grain of a stone before she set it. And by the time she was 17, she was doing finish work that he charged full rate for. She had not always understood why he brought her and not the hired men to the jobs that required the closest attention. She understood it now. He had died the previous winter of a lung ailment that the cold had worsened in the narrow house in Lexington where they had lived since she was 8 years old. He had left her the tools and the house and a small amount held in a savings institution, and she had sold the house in the spring because the savings were not enough to carry the taxes on it, and she had used part of what the sale produced to pay off a note he had carried since 1879 on a piece of grading equipment. What remained after the note and the taxes and the expenses of his burial was enough to live carefully for 1 year if she did not encounter anything unexpected, and enough to purchase a condemned chapel in a mountain county for $1 with money left over for timber and lime. He had left her 2 things of value: his tools and his knowledge of how old stone tells the truth about what was built behind it. She had not come to Caldwell Crossing for the chapel. She had come for what the chapel sat on top of. There is a kind of attention a trained mason pays to the ground beneath a structure, and it is not the attention most people would recognize as looking for anything. It reads in the way water sits after a rain, in the way frost heaves a certain section of the foundation wall, in the way a stone floor sounds hollow beneath a boot heel in a place where, by rights, there should be nothing hollow. Nora's father had described it to her once as listening with your feet. She had been 11 years old, and she had not understood him then. She was 28 now, and she understood him completely. She had ridden through Caldwell Crossing the previous spring on a different errand, and had paused at the road above the condemned chapel long enough to observe two things. The first was that the east gable's crack ran in a line consistent with differential settling, which meant the ground beneath the east end of the chapel was softer than beneath the west, which meant there was a void, or an infill, or a chamber. The second was that the foundation's east corner showed a dressed stone lintel set horizontally at ground level, partially earthed over by decades of slope wash, and dressed stone set horizontally at ground level in an old limestone chapel usually meant one of two things: a drainage culvert or a door. She had gone to the county clerk's office in April and asked to see the original deed. The clerk had found it after some time in a box of papers from the 1840s, handwritten on a long sheet of foolscap in a hand that had been educated but hasty. The deed described the lot, the structure, and the rights of way, and at the bottom it listed the improvements with the brevity of the era: chapel 40 by 20 feet, limestone, and below that, in different ink and a different hand, the notation that had brought Nora back in October: Crypt, below grade, east end, private. No subsequent deed mentioned a crypt. No survey amended it into the county record. The probate filing when the congregation dissolved in 1869 listed only the chapel and the lot. Whatever lay beneath the east end of that condemned shell had been noted once, in an addendum, and then had not been noted again. If you have ever found a room that was not supposed to exist, you understand the particular quality of the silence that follows the finding. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of a thing that has been holding its breath. The first week, Nora lived in a canvas shelter she built against the west wall, which was still intact and blocked the prevailing wind. She used her father's tools selectively, not yet for excavation, but for assessment. She tapped the foundation course with the handle of a masonry hammer and moved along it, listening. The west end rang solid. The south wall rang solid for 20 feet, then gave a subtle change of tone, the faintest deepening, the kind of change that required you to already know what you were listening for. The east end, when she reached it, rang hollow for a length of perhaps 12 feet. Not the hollow of a drainage culvert. 12 feet of hollow beneath a stone floor was a chamber. The work of uncovering the lintel took 4 days. The slope wash had built up over 40 years, and beneath the slope wash was a deliberate earthen infill that someone had packed in, hard and methodical. At some point after the original construction, she removed it with a short-handled spade and a brush, working in layers, the way her father had taught her to work when you did not know what the next inch would hold. She did not rush. The mountain was not going anywhere, and neither was whatever lay beneath it. The first day she removed 8 inches of slope wash and found nothing but packed clay and the occasional fragment of old roof slate that had washed down from above. The second day she went deeper and found the transition, a layer of earth that was different in color and consistency from the slope wash above it, darker, more uniform, the kind of fill that someone had brought in rather than let accumulate. She marked the edge of it with a stick and spent the rest of that day clearing the slope wash around the edges of the transition to understand its extent. It was roughly 6 feet wide and ran along the base of the east wall for perhaps 10 feet. The third day she began removing the fill in earnest, working from the top down, keeping the layers flat so that if anything had been placed in the fill itself, she would not miss it. There was nothing in the fill. It was clean earth, tamped in lifts of perhaps 4 inches each. The kind of fill a man who knew what he was doing would produce if he had time to do it carefully. She found the upper edge of the dressed stone lintel in the late afternoon of the third day, 2 feet below the current grade, and she stopped and cleaned the exposed face of it with the brush and looked at it in the failing light. The lintel was a single piece, perhaps 6 inches by 18, set horizontally. The bottom edge of it was dressed smooth with a broad chisel. The top edge had been left rough, taking the load of the wall above. It was the lintel of a door opening. She ate her supper that evening with more attention than usual, and she slept soundly. On the fourth day, she removed the remaining fill in front of the opening and found the iron door. It was not large, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, framed in dressed limestone with a flat arch above, the kind of arch a competent mason built when he was working with good stone and had time. The door was a single slab of iron, hinged on the right, with a lever latch rather than a lock. It had been sealed from the outside by the earthen infill rather than by any mechanical lock, which told her something about the nature of the sealing. Whoever had covered it over had not expected anyone to need to open it, or had not expected anyone to know to look. She pressed her palm flat against the iron. It was cold in the way that stone and iron are cold in October, but it was also the cold of a sealed space behind it. There is a difference between cold that is of the air and cold that has been kept. She recognized the second kind. She did not open it that day. She made note of the condition of the hinge plates, which were surface rusted but not structurally compromised, and she cleared the remaining earth from the frame, and she ate her supper beside a small fire she made from fallen timber, and she slept. She had learned from her father that the opening of an old sealed space was a singular moment that could not be taken back, and that it deserved to be approached deliberately. The morning of the fifth day was clear and cold, with frost on the slope wash she had piled to one side, and a thin bright sky above the ridge. Nora heated a cup of water over the fire, drank it and put on her shawl. She gathered what she would need: a lamp, a small flat pry bar for the latch if it had seized, a square of canvas to spread on the ground for anything she brought out. She set these things in order beside the excavated entrance and knelt in front of the iron door. The latch moved on the first attempt, stiffly, with resistance, but it moved. The hinge pins were set deep in the stone and held. She pulled the door open slowly with both hands, and the air that came out was cold and dry and carried the particular smell of sealed limestone and old wood, a smell that has no equivalent in any above-ground space. It is the smell of time that has been kept in a jar. She lifted the lamp and looked in. The crypt was a single vaulted room, perhaps 14 feet by 10, with a barrel vault of dressed limestone overhead that was, as far as she could see, intact. The floor was packed earth, dry. Along the north wall were 3 burial niches cut directly into the stone, each sealed with a limestone slab mortared in place. Along the south wall, on a low stone shelf, were 7 objects: 4 wooden boxes of varying size, a ceramic jar with a pressed-in lid, a rolled oilskin tied with a cord, and a small iron strongbox. None of it had been disturbed since the door was sealed. The 3 burial niches were not her concern. The dead interred in them had been placed there by people who had chosen this place for them, and she would leave them as she had found them, sealed and quiet. The dead were not what the crypt held that she had come for. She understood this with clarity before she had crossed the threshold. The purpose of entering a sealed room is not to disturb what rests there, but to understand what was placed there to be kept. She brought the oilskin out first. She set it on the canvas square and did not open it immediately, She sat on the cold ground outside the crypt entrance with the lamp between her knees and looked at the object for a moment before she touched it. The cord was dry and brittle, but untied without breaking. The oilskin unrolled in 4 sections, folded over each other the way a careful person folds something they expect to leave for a long time, and inside was a document handwritten, 12 pages of close script in a hand she recognized from the deed addendum. Same writer, same ink, or nearly the same. The kind of iron gall that darkens as it ages and turns almost black after 30 years sealed in the dark. The document was dated May of 1861, 2 months after the secession of the Southern states and 2 weeks before Harlan County had formally declared for the Union. She read it through once without stopping, then read it again, slowly. It was a deed of trust, not the kind that transferred property, the kind that transferred obligation. The document named a man called Silas Vance, identified as the elder of the Caldwell Ridge Methodist congregation, and it stated that Vance had received in trust, on behalf of 17 named families of the Caldwell Crossing Valley, the sum of $4,200 in gold coin and 240 acres of bottomland title, to be held until such time as the war was concluded and the subscribing families could safely return or send for their holdings. The document was signed by Silas Vance on the first page and by each of the subscribing families or their male heads of household on the pages following. The families named in the document were primarily of German and Welsh descent, several of them recent settlers to Harlan County, a few of them farmers who had come from the hill counties of Virginia in the decade before the war and had taken up bottom land along the creek and begun to make something of it. They had known that the war would come to the valley. They had been right about that. They had known they did not know which side of it they would be on, and they had trusted their holdings to a man who had seemed, in the spring of 1861, like a reliable steward. At the bottom of the final page, in a hand that Nora read as less practiced than the document's main body, was a postscript written after the fact in a different ink, undated. It stated that Silas Vance had died in the summer of 1863 without having communicated the existence of the trust or the location of its records to any surviving member of the congregation. It stated that the subscribing families, those who had survived the war and returned to the valley, had applied to the Vance family for accounting and had received no response. It stated that the writer of the postscript believed the document should be preserved where it could be found by someone with the wit to look for it. The writer had not signed the postscript. Nora looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down. She sat with the document for a long time, in the cold, outside the crypt door, with the lamp burning beside her. Then she brought out the iron strongbox. The lock on the strongbox was a simple lever mechanism, and it had been left open, the shackle not fully engaged. Inside was a single folded sheet, and on it, in the same hand as the deed of trust, a partial accounting, dated September of 1862, listing the coin by denomination and the land title by parcel number, and at the bottom, in a different entry and a different date, March of 1863, a single notation in the same hand, deposited with Ambrose Vance, Lexington for safekeeping, pending resolution of hostilities. Ambrose Vance. Nora knew that name, not from Caldwell Crossing, from Lexington, where Ambrose Vance had died in 1877, leaving an estate that had been administered by his son, a man named Garrett Vance, who had been a clerk in the county auditor's office for 11 years and was, at the time, Nora sat in the October cold reading a dead man's accounting, still employed there. She put the document back in the strongbox. She put the oilskin back in its tube and retied the cord. She photographed nothing, because cameras were not yet common tools in her world, but she had her father's instinct for measurement, and she spent 2 hours making a careful written record of everything she had seen and read, copying the key passages of the deed of trust in her own hand, numbering the names of the subscribing families, noting the parcel numbers from the accounting. She replaced everything on the stone shelf as she had found it. She sealed the iron door and began to pack the earth back around the frame, not to hide what she had found, but because the dead inside that room deserved their quiet, and because she had no intention of allowing anyone else to remove what was stored there before she had done what needed doing. It took her 3 days to ride from Caldwell Crossing to Lexington. She slept one night at a farmhouse and paid for her supper. She arrived in the city on a Thursday morning and went directly to the offices of a lawyer named Poole, who had handled her father's estate, and whom she trusted with the specific trust one extends to a person who has done one careful thing well. She spread her handwritten copy of the deed of trust on his desk and told him where she had found it and what accompanied it in the crypt below the chapel she had purchased for $1 in October. Poole read the document without speaking for a long time. When he was done, he set it down and looked at her. The 17 families named in that document, or their descendants, are owed an accounting, she said, her voice quiet. The coin and the land title were deposited with Ambrose Vance in 1863. His estate passed to his son. His son has been managing county finances for 11 years. I want to know what happened to $4,200 and 240 acres. Poole said he would need to see the original documents before he could do anything. She said she knew that. She had not needed him to tell her that. She had needed him to confirm, as a man trained in the law, that what she held was sufficient basis for an inquiry, and he had done so by the way he read it. A man who reads a document with the care Poole applied to the deed of trust is a man who recognizes what he is reading. He had read it twice, and on the second reading he had gone back to a particular passage in the second page and read it a third time. That was enough. She went back to Caldwell Crossing to recover the originals and returned to Lexington 8 days later. Poole examined them in the presence of a second attorney, a man named Ferris, whom he trusted on matters of estate law, and both men confirmed that the deed of trust was genuine, that the signatures of the subscribing families were witnessed and attested in proper form, and that the accounting in the strongbox was in the same hand as the trust document and constituted a contemporaneous record. What followed over the next 4 months was not dramatic in the manner that stories are sometimes made to be dramatic. There was no confrontation in a public square. There was no public accusation. Poole filed a petition with the circuit court, citing the deed of trust and requesting production of records from the estate of Ambrose Vance. The estate records had been lodged with the county clerk when the estate closed in 1879. Garrett Vance, informed of the petition by his supervisor in the auditor's office, submitted a written response through his own counsel, stating that he had no knowledge of any trust arrangement and that the estate of his father had been properly administered and closed. The circuit court granted production. The records arrived in Poole's office in a bound bundle in February of 1884. Poole spent 2 days with the bundle and came to find Nora at the boarding house where she had been staying while she waited. He spread the records on the table and pointed to specific pages without theatrical commentary, the way a careful man delivers information that should be allowed to land without ornamentation. The land title was not among them. 240 acres of Harlan County bottomland, listed in the original accounting by parcel number, did not appear in the estate inventory. What did appear in a transaction dated November of 1867 was a sale of 240 acres in Harlan County to a land speculation company based in Lexington, with Ambrose Vance listed as the seller, for a sum of $1,100. He had sold land he held in trust at a Depression-era price to buyers he had arranged himself, and had absorbed the proceeds into his personal estate. The coin, $4,200 in gold, did not appear in the estate records at all. There was no notation of it, no inventory item that accounted for a sum of that size, no bank record of a deposit, no transfer. Ambrose Vance had received the coin in 1863 and had not recorded it anywhere that the estate records showed. Either it had been spent across 20 years in small enough quantities that it blended into ordinary household expenditure, or it had been moved in a single transaction that had been kept out of the formal record. Poole said he believed the former was more likely, because a single large transaction would have been harder to hide, and Ambrose Vance had been, by all accounts, a careful man. A careful man who had done a careless thing or a deliberate one, and had trusted that no one would look behind the wall where the record was kept. Poole took the circuit court petition and the production records to the state attorney, who had jurisdiction over the matter of a public official, Garrett Vance, having potentially benefited from an estate that had absorbed trust assets. The matter moved through channels that were not fast, but were not, in the end, ineffective. Garrett Vance resigned his position in the auditor's office in the spring of 1884. He did not contest the proceeding. His attorney submitted a letter of settlement that included an offer of $2,000, which Poole rejected on behalf of the subscribing families named descendants as insufficient. The final settlement, reached in the summer of 1884, was $4,800, adjusted for the original sum and interest, distributed through the circuit court to the documented descendants of the 17 subscribing families. Finding the descendants had required work. Poole had hired a man to trace them, and 9 of the 17 families had surviving descendants who could be located and documented in Kentucky. 5 more had descendants who had moved to Ohio and Indiana during the war years and had been found through church records and county directories. 3 of the families had no documented descendants, and the court set their portion in trust pending any future claim. The bottom land could not be fully recovered. It had passed through multiple transactions, and the title chain was too long and too clouded. But the cash settlement was honored, and the names of the 17 families were entered in the court record with a notation that their original deposit had been received in trust and not honored. The notation was specific. It named Silas Vance as the original trustee, Ambrose Vance as the successor who had taken custody of the assets, and the assets themselves by the amounts and descriptions in the deed of trust. It was, in that sense, the accounting the subscribing families had been asking for since 1865. Nora was not in the courtroom the day the settlement was entered. She had been back in Caldwell Crossing since March, working on the chapel roof. She had hired 2 local men to help with the heavy timbers, brothers named Adkins from the valley floor, who knew how to handle long stock and did not ask unnecessary questions. She mixed the lime herself and supervised the placement of every rafter. The pitch she had calculated from the remaining evidence of the original rafter seats in the wall plates, which told her what angle the old builders had chosen, and she replicated it. It was a good angle for a ridge roof in a county that received heavy snow, and whoever had built the chapel originally had known something about winter. She kept that. The stonework she did herself. She repointed the south wall from the foundation to the windowsills, mixing the mortar to a specific ratio of lime and sand that matched the original work as closely as she could read it, because mortar that does not match its parent stone in flexibility will eventually crack the stone rather than the joint, and the stone was what mattered. The east gable crack she addressed from the top down, wetting the joint thoroughly before filling it so the new mortar would not dry too fast and pull away from the old stone. She filled it in 3 passes over 2 days, each pass allowed to set before the next was applied. The crack disappeared into the wall and did not come back. By September of 1884, The chapel had a sound roof and 4 solid walls. The east gable was plumb within a quarter of an inch. The iron door below the east end remained in place, cleaned and rehinged with new pintles set in lead in the original holes, and she had repaired the drainage along the east base of the building so that runoff moved away from the foundation rather than against it. The 3 niches in the crypt had stayed dry throughout the summer, which confirmed that the original builders had gotten the drainage right, and it had only been the blocked outlet at the base of the east wall that had allowed seepage to begin. She did not repurpose the crypt. The 3 burial niches remained sealed and quiet, as they had been for 40 years and would remain. The stone shelf along the south wall was empty now, the documents removed and held in the circuit court as exhibits. The room was clean and dry and would stay that way. She had no use for the chapel itself, and no plans that anyone in Caldwell Crossing had been told about. What she had was a sound stone building on 1/5 of an acre, paid for with 4 quarters, and the knowledge that the land beneath it had once been the custodian of a truth that needed bringing out. The men who had laughed at her bid that October morning did not say much to her now when she passed them on the road. Not with hostility, not with great warmth. They looked at the work she had done on the chapel, and they looked at her and they did not say anything in particular. One of them, the man whose laugh had been the clearest, held a gate open for her one afternoon in August and said the east gable looked solid. She agreed that it did. That was the whole of it. An old woman named Hattie Sears, whose grandmother had been among the 17 subscribing families, came to see the chapel in early October, 1 year almost to the day from the auction. She had ridden up from the valley floor on a mule that she tied to the gatepost with the ease of a woman who had been tying mules to gateposts her entire life. She was perhaps 65 years old, spare and straight-backed, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something firm and clear-eyed. She did not introduce herself immediately. She looked at the chapel first. She stood in front of the repaired east gable for some time without speaking. Then she went around the south side of the building, trailing one hand along the repointed wall without looking at it, feeling the surface the way an older person confirms with their hands what their eyes have already reported. She went around to the east side and stood in front of the low area where the excavation had been, now turfed over and draining properly. The iron door fitted with its new hasp, set flush against the limestone frame. She did not reach for the hasp. She stood in front of the door for perhaps a full minute, then turned and walked back around to the front of the chapel and looked at the restored window above the door, which was empty of glass but framed in sound-dressed limestone, the new pointing visible only if you were looking for it. Then she looked at Nora for the first time with the direct attention of a woman who has been looking at the building, not the person, and has now made up her mind about both. "My grandmother never thought she would see that money again," Hattie Sears said. "It was not the full amount," Nora said. "The land was gone." "No," Hattie Sears said, "but most of it." She did not say anything more about it. She asked Nora a few practical questions about the mortar she had used on the east gable, and she looked at the roof trim on the south eave for a moment, and then she untied her mule and mounted with a short, businesslike motion and rode back down the ridge road in the late afternoon light, the valley spreading wide and gold and hazy below her. Nora watched her go from the low stone wall at the front of the property, the red shawl around her shoulders against the October chill, until the mule and rider disappeared around the first bend of the road below the tree line. If you have ever found the thing you were trained all your life to find, you know that the finding of it is not the end of anything. It is the completion of one motion in a longer piece of work. The stone is set, the mortar cures, the wall stands, and you move to the next wall. That is the nature of craft. The tools Nora used to repoint the chapel's south wall were the same tools her father had used to point the foundation of a church in Lexington in 1858. The handles were worn smooth where the palm wraps, the marks of his grip preserved in the wood, and she held them the same way he had held them, in the same grip, because he had taught her the grip, and it was the right grip for this kind of stone. She left Caldwell Crossing in November, after the first frost had settled the newly pointed mortar, and she had confirmed the east gable was cured and solid. She left the chapel in the care of a young minister who had inquired about it in September, a careful man who planned to reestablish a congregation on the ridge, and she transferred the deed to him for the same dollar she had paid, on the condition that the crypt below was documented in the deed as a historical feature and left undisturbed. He agreed to those terms without hesitation. The deed she signed in the county clerk's office that November included, for the first time since the original 1861 addendum, a full description of the crypt, its dimensions, its contents, its condition, and its 3 sealed burial niches. It was entered in the county record and indexed under the parcel number, and it was not something that could be lost again, or earthed over, or left out of a subsequent filing. Some things that are buried should stay buried. The 3 people in those niches had been laid there by people who loved them, in a room built to hold them gently, and that was where they would remain. But the record of what a room holds is a different matter. A record left out of a filing is not a record. It is a silence that benefits whoever profits from the silence. The county clerk, when she handed him the new deed to index, glanced at the crypt description and then at her, and asked whether she was the woman who had bought the condemned chapel for $1. She said she was. He nodded once, the way a careful man nods at something he wants to mark without commenting on, and he logged the deed in the index, and that was the end of that. Nora Kane rode south on the November road with her father's tools in a roll of oilskin behind her saddle. The red wool shawl was around her shoulders, and the air was cold, and the valley below Caldwell Crossing was the color of dry grass and iron. She did not look back at the chapel. She had looked at it enough. The work was done, and the stone would stand, and the record was in the index, and the money was in the hands of the people who had earned it a generation ago by trusting someone who should have been trustworthy. Her father had told her once, when she was young and impatient with a stubborn stone that would not seat correctly, that the stone was not being stubborn. The stone was being a stone. It had its own grain, its own weight, its own way of wanting to lie, and your job was not to force it but to understand it and work with what it was. She had been frustrated with him at the time, the way a young person is frustrated with instruction that sounds like philosophy when you wanted a practical correction. She understood him now the way she understood most of what he had taught her. Not all at once, but in the middle of doing the thing he had shown her, when the lesson and the work collapsed into the same motion and there was nothing left to explain. The road bent south around the ridge, and the chapel disappeared behind the tree line, and the valley opened below her in the cold November light, wide and quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of things that have already been settled. She did not subscribe to the idea that anyone finding closed all the questions a thing could hold. The crypt had held what it held. She had brought it out. The stone above it was now sound. There would be another title, another parcel, another sealed door that someone had earthed over and forgotten to record. She had her father's tools. She knew how to listen. If you have ever carried something that was given to you by someone who trusted you with it, you know that the weight of it changes how you move, not in a way that slows you down, in a way that steadies you, that orients you toward the thing the weight was meant for. The tools rode behind her saddle, in the oilskin roll, the way they had always traveled, since the first time her father had packed them and let her carry the roll on a job when she was 14 years old. They were not heavy. They had never been heavy. They were the weight of knowing something that most people did not know, and that knowing had a direction to it, always, like a compass needle that does not argue about where north is. She rode south in the November cold, and the road was hard under the frost, and the sky above the ridge was the pale, clear blue of late autumn, and the work was done, and the record was in the index, and the stone would stand. Have you ever found something that had been buried not by accident but by choice? Something someone decided the world was better off not knowing? Leave a word below if this kind of story is one you would press play for on a cold evening. There is another waiting, just like it, whenever you are ready.